Maya Peterson had always been the quiet one in Professor Callahan's advanced sociology class. While most students raised their hands to answer questions or joined heated debates about social theories, Maya sat in the back corner, her dark hair falling forward as she leaned over her notebook. Every day she'd arrive 5 minutes early, choose the same seat by the window, and leave without drawing attention to herself. The other students barely noticed her. College was like that. Everyone wrapped up in their own worlds of deadlines, social lives, and future plans. In a class of 30 students, it was easy for someone to fade into the background, especially when they never volunteered answers or joined study groups at the campus coffee shop. Professor Callahan, however, had been teaching long enough to recognize that the quietest students often harbored the deepest thoughts. He'd noticed how Maya's eyes followed classroom discussions with intense focus, how her pen never stopped moving across her notebook pages. While others typed notes on laptops, half distracted by social media notifications, Maya filled page after page with careful handwriting. The professor had caught glimpses of her notes, once or twice, not just bullet points of his lecture, but thoughtful diagrams connecting concepts in ways he hadn't explicitly taught. What nobody in the classroom knew was that Maya's silence wasn't shyness or disinterest. It was a carefully built wall, constructed brick by brick through years of experience. As the daughter of refugee parents who had fled their home country during a brutal civil war, Maya had grown up listening to stories that most of her classmates could only encounter in history books or news reports. Her family lived in a modest apartment across town, far from the expensive student housing near campus. Each morning, Maya rode the bus for 45 minutes to reach her classes. During those rides, she observed the city changing around her. From the neighborhood where families like hers struggled to make ends meet to the gleaming buildings of the university district. These daily journeys became her first sociology lessons, long before she ever signed up for Professor Callahan's class. At home, Maya's parents worked hard to give her opportunities they never had. Her father drove a taxi during the day and worked as a janitor at night. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families and took in sewing work when she could find it. Neither of them had been able to finish their education back home. Her father had been studying engineering and her mother literature. When they were forced to flee, "Education is the one thing nobody can take from you," her father often told her. "Everything else, homes, possessions, even countries, can be lost. But what's in your mind stays with you." This was why, despite their financial struggles, her parents never questioned the cost of her textbooks or the long hours she spent studying instead of working, more shifts at her weekend job at the grocery store. Maya had learned early on that sharing too much of her family's story often made others uncomfortable. In high school, mentioning her parents' experiences had created awkward silences, or worse, turned her into a class project, the refugee kid who needed special attention. By college, she'd perfected the art of brief, vague answers that satisfied curiosity without revealing too much. In Professor Callahan's class, they studied social structures, power dynamics, and how communities form and change over time. While her classmates discussed these theories as abstract concepts, Maya saw them played out in her daily life. The way her mother's accent determined how she was treated in stores, how her father's foreign degree meant nothing to potential employers here. The invisible lines that divided neighborhoods and opportunities. The day that would eventually change everything started like any other. It was mid-October, leaves crunching underfoot as Maya walked from the bus stop to campus. The morning air was crisp, carrying that distinct fall smell that meant winter wasn't far behind. She arrived at class early as usual, settling into her corner seat and arranging her notebook and pens in their precise order on her desk. Li Wei, one of the few students who occasionally acknowledged her with a smile, arrived next. He had moved from China to study business and sometimes sat near her, though they rarely spoke beyond brief greetings. Today he looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested a late night studying. "Big test in economics yesterday," he explained when he caught her looking. Maya nodded sympathetically. She appreciated that Li Wei never pushed for conversation, but seemed to respect her quietness. The classroom gradually filled with the usual chatter. Brent and his friends from the lacrosse team took up the center row, their confident voices carrying across the room as they discussed weekend plans. Zoe and Priya, always together, sat near the front, already debating the reading assignment. Professor Callahan's graduate assistant, Alex, was setting up the projector for today's presentation. At precisely 10 a.m., Professor Callahan strode in, his gray hair slightly disheveled as always, carrying a stack of papers under one arm and a travel mug of coffee in his free hand. "Good morning, everyone," he said, placing his materials on the desk. "Before we dive into today's lecture on social capital, I want to discuss your midterm projects." The room collectively tensed. Midterm projects were a significant portion of their grade, and Professor Callahan was known for assigning challenging work that pushed students beyond textbook theories. "This semester, we're doing something different," he continued, taking a sip from his mug. "Instead of individual papers, you'll work in pairs on a presentation called Invisible Connections in Society." A mixture of groans and interested murmurs filled the room. Group projects always created anxiety. Who you worked with could make or break your grade. Your task is to identify and present a concept that reveals hidden connections between people in society. Connections we might overlook, but that significantly impact how we relate to each other. Maya's heart beat faster. For once, an assignment spoke directly to the observations she'd been collecting her entire life but never shared. She glanced around the room, wondering who she might be paired with, a flutter of anxiety mixing with unexpected excitement. "I've already assigned the pairs," Professor Callahan announced, crushing the hopes of friends who were making eye contact across the room. He began reading names from his list, and students shuffled in their seats, some looking pleased, others disappointed. "Leeway and Priya," he read. "Zoe and Brent." He continued down his list. Maya waited, growing increasingly nervous as more names were called. Working closely with someone would mean talking, sharing ideas, maybe revealing parts of herself she usually kept hidden. "Maya Peterson," Professor Callahan finally said, "and Thomas Chen." Maya looked across the room to where Thomas sat. Everyone knew Thomas. He was pre-law, president of the debate club, and came from a family of successful lawyers. He always had thoughtful comments in class and seemed comfortable speaking in front of others. He caught her eye and gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. As Professor Callahan finished explaining the project requirements, Maya's mind raced. This assignment could be her chance to finally give voice to the ideas that had been forming in her mind for years. Or it could be a disaster if Thomas took over completely or dismissed her. Contributions. When class ended, students gathered into their newly assigned pairs, filling the room with conversation as they exchanged phone numbers and scheduled meetings. Maya slowly packed her notebook, watching as Thomas said goodbye to his friends and made his way toward her corner. "Hi," he said, standing beside her desk. "I don't think we've really talked before." "I'm Thomas." "Maya," she replied softly, zipping her backpack. "Do you have time to meet at the library this afternoon to start brainstorming?" he asked. "I have mock trial until 4, but I'm free after that." Maya thought about her evening shift at the grocery store. "I can meet at 4:30, but I need to leave by 6. "That works," Thomas said with an easy smile. "Main library, second floor study rooms? I can reserve one online." Maya nodded, surprised by how businesslike and efficient the interaction was. No awkward questions about why she never spoke in class, no immediate suggestions that dominated the project direction. As they walked out of the classroom together, neither realized that this simple project pairing would become the catalyst for a moment that would change not just their perspectives, but those of everyone in the class. For now, Maya was simply the quiet girl, her mind already filling with possibilities for finally bringing her observations into the light. The university library stood like an ancient fortress among the more modern campus buildings. Inside, the second-floor study rooms were hidden behind tall shelves filled with reference books that hardly anyone touched anymore. Maya arrived 10 minutes early, as was her habit with everything. She chose a seat facing the door and pulled out her notebook, already filled with ideas that had kept her awake most of the night. The study room smelled of old books and the pine-scented cleaner the janitors used. Through the glass walls, Maya could see students walking past, some laughing with friends, others hurrying with worried expressions that suggested approaching deadlines. She watched them, noticing the small details that most people missed. How some walked with confidence that came from never having to question their place here, while others moved more cautiously, as if apologizing for taking up space. At exactly 4:30, Thomas appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. His dark blue mock trial suit had been swapped for jeans and a university sweatshirt. "Sorry if I'm late," he said, dropping his backpack on the table. "Professor Wilson always keeps us overtime." "You're not late," Maya said quietly. "I was early." Thomas nodded, pulling out his laptop and a water bottle. "So, invisible connections in society," he said, jumping straight to business. "Pretty broad topic. I was thinking we could focus on something like economic interdependence or maybe social media networks." Maya hesitated, her fingers tracing the spiral binding of her notebook. This was the hard part. Speaking up, sharing ideas, making herself visible. "I actually had some thoughts," she said, her voice so soft that Thomas leaned forward to hear better. "If you're open to them." Something in her tone made Thomas pause. He closed his laptop and gave her his full attention, which was unusual in Maya's experience. Most people were always half listening, already formulating their response before you finished speaking. "Of course," he said. "That's why we're meeting, right? To brainstorm together." Taking a deep breath, Maya opened her notebook. "I've been thinking about what Professor Callahan meant by invisible connections. Most of the examples he gave were about systems, economic, political, technological. But I think there are more personal invisible connections too." Thomas tilted his head, curious. "What kind of personal connections?" "The spaces left by absence," Maya said, the words coming out more confidently than she expected. "The way loss creates holes in people's lives that connect them to others who have experienced similar losses, even if they never meet or speak about it." Thomas stared at her for a moment. "That's not what I expected," he admitted. "But it's interesting. Can you explain more?" Maya flipped through her notebook. "I've been calling it Echoes of Absence. It's about how empty spaces aren't really empty. They're filled with meaning that connects people across different backgrounds." For the first time in any class project, Maya found herself talking while someone else listened. She explained how she'd observed patterns in how people coped with different kinds of loss. Lost homelands, lost opportunities, lost loved ones, and how these experiences created invisible communities of understanding. "It's like, when you lose something important, you start noticing others who carry similar losses," she explained. "You recognize the signs in how they talk about certain topics or avoid others, or in the way they value what remains." Thomas was quiet for so long that Maya worried she'd said too much. Maybe her idea was too abstract, too personal for an academic project. Finally, he spoke. "My mom died when I was 14. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Maya didn't offer condolences or ask questions. She just nodded, recognizing the significance of him sharing this piece of himself. "Cancer," he added. "It was quick. Diagnosis to funeral in 3 months." "I'm sorry," Maya said softly. "The thing is," Thomas continued, "what you're talking about makes sense to me. After she died, I suddenly noticed all these other people who had lost parents. It was like joining a club nobody wants to be part of, but once you're in, you see the other members everywhere." For the next hour, their conversation flowed more naturally than either had expected. Thomas shared how his father had thrown himself into work after his mother's death, how his perfect grades and endless extracurricular activities were partly driven by trying to fill the void she left. "Everyone thinks they know me," he said with a bitter laugh. "Thomas Chen, future lawyer, has it all figured out. Nobody sees the part where I'm still that 14-year-old kid trying to make his mom proud." The admission created a shift between them. It wasn't just a project partnership anymore, but something closer to understanding. Maya, who rarely shared personal details, found herself telling Thomas about her parents. Not everything, but enough. "They left everything behind," she explained. "Their home, their careers, family members they never saw again. I grew up watching them rebuild their lives from nothing." Thomas nodded. "That's a different kind of loss than mine, but I can see the connection." As 6 o'clock approached, they had filled several pages with notes and ideas. Their concept was taking shape, how absence creates its own presence in people's lives, and how these absences form connections across different experiences. "I need to get to work," Maya said, gathering her things. "My shift starts at 6:30. "Where do you work?" Thomas asked. "Westside Grocery," she replied. "It's not far from where I live." Thomas nodded, making no comment about the distance from campus or the type of job. "Can we meet again tomorrow, same time? I think we're onto something really good here." Maya hesitated, then nodded. I have the same shift tomorrow, but I'm free on Thursday after 3. Thursday works, Thomas agreed. I'll book the room again. As they walked out of the library together, an unexpected light rain had started falling, turning the campus path slick and reflective under the street lamps. Do you need a ride to work? Thomas asked. My car's in the east lot. Maya almost declined automatically. She was used to handling things herself, to not imposing on others. But the rain was getting heavier, and the bus would take twice as long. If it's not too much trouble, she said. No trouble, Thomas replied. His car was newer than anything her family had ever owned, but not flashy, a practical sedan in dark gray. Inside, the passenger seat held a stack of law review journals that he moved to the back before she got in. The drive to Westside Grocery took them, through changing neighborhoods, from the manicured university area to the more diverse, working-class district where Maya lived. Thomas drove competently, making easy conversation about classes and professors without pressing for personal details or asking why she lived so far from campus. When they arrived at the grocery store, with its flickering fluorescent sign and faded blue paint, Thomas pulled up to the entrance. So Thursday at 3, he confirmed. Maya nodded, reaching for the door handle. Thomas, she said, pausing, thank you for listening to my idea. For the project, I mean. It's a great concept, he said seriously. Better than anything I was thinking. This could be something special. As Maya walked into work, pulling her green employee vest from her backpack, she felt something she hadn't expected from this project, a sense of possibility. For once, her observations about the world might find voice beyond the pages of her private notebook. Over the next few days, Maya and Thomas met regularly, developing their presentation. What started as a theoretical concept became more concrete as they collected examples, from literature, history, news stories, and cautiously, their own experiences. The key is to make it relatable, Thomas said during one of their sessions. Everyone has experienced some kind of loss or absence, even if it's not as dramatic as war or death. Maya nodded, like missing out on opportunities or feeling like you don't belong somewhere, or even just nostalgia for places that have changed. They decided to structure their presentation as a series of concentric circles, starting with small, everyday absences that everyone could recognize, then moving to deeper, more significant losses, showing how each created connections between people who might otherwise have nothing in common. One afternoon, as they worked in the library, Thomas looked up from his laptop with a thoughtful expression. You know what I've realized? He said. I've spent 3 years in that sociology class talking all the time, but I'm not sure I've ever said anything as meaningful as what we're working on right now. Maya smiled slightly. Maybe talking less lets you observe more. Maybe, Thomas agreed. Or maybe some people just have more worth saying. He held her gaze for a moment before turning back to his screen. As the presentation date approached, they finalized their slides and practiced their delivery. Thomas, experienced from debate club, was naturally comfortable speaking to an audience. Maya was not, but the importance of their message pushed her past her usual reluctance. You don't have to speak for long, Thomas assured her. I can do most of the talking if you want. Maya shook her head. No, this is our project together. And some parts I need to explain myself. The night before their presentation, Maya sat at the small desk in her bedroom, looking through family photographs. She selected one, her parents standing in front of their apartment building the day they moved in, their faces tired but hopeful. It had been their first real home in this country after 2 years in a refugee center. She carefully placed the photo in her backpack, along with her grandmother's hand-embroidered scarf, one of the few possessions her mother had managed to bring with them. These weren't just visual aids for tomorrow's presentation. They were anchors, reminders of why this concept mattered beyond a class grade. As she finally fell asleep, Maya wondered if she was making a mistake by revealing so much of herself to the class. For years, she'd protected her privacy, kept her thoughts to herself. Tomorrow, she would step out of the shadows, making herself visible in a way she never had before. The thought was terrifying, and yet somehow it also felt right, as if all her years of quiet observation had been leading to this moment. The morning of their final preparation session dawned with unexpected warmth for October. The trees outside Maya's apartment window were losing their leaves, creating patches of red and gold against the faded concrete of the parking lot. Maya had hardly slept, her mind spinning with thoughts about tomorrow's presentation. It wasn't just anxiety about speaking in front of the class. It was the weight of finally giving voice to ideas she'd carried silently for so long. She dressed carefully in jeans and a simple blue sweater that her mother had bought her when she got accepted to university. "For your new life," her mother had said, her eyes bright with pride and unshed tears. Maya tucked her grandmother's scarf into her bag, not planning to wear it until the presentation tomorrow. The bus ride to campus felt different today. Maya found herself studying the other passengers more intentionally, wondering about the absences they carried. The older man with weathered hands who always read a paperback novel. The young mother who sang softly to her baby in a language Maya didn't recognize. The teenager with headphones and eyes that seemed too tired for his age. What losses had shaped them? What empty spaces connected them to others they'd never meet? Thomas was already waiting when she arrived at their usual study room. He'd brought coffee for both of them, plain black for himself and one with cream and sugar for her, remembering her preference from a previous session. This small consideration touched Maya more than she expected. "Big day tomorrow," Thomas said, pushing her cup toward her. "How are you feeling about it?" Maya wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Nervous," she admitted. "But ready, I think." Thomas nodded. "I was up late working on the visual slides." "Want to see?" He turned his laptop toward her. The presentation design was clean and thoughtful, not flashy or over-decorated like many student projects. Each slide carried simple images that supported their concept without distracting from it. An empty chair at a dinner table, hands reaching across a gap, a child's drawing of a family with one figure partly erased. "These are perfect," Maya said softly. "Where did you find these images?" Thomas looked slightly embarrassed. "I actually made most of them myself. I used to do a lot of photography before law school became the plan." "You never mentioned that before," Maya said, surprised by this new piece of information about her project partner. Thomas shrugged. "It doesn't fit the future lawyer image very well." "My dad thinks it's a waste of time." "They're really good," Maya insisted. "They capture exactly what we're trying to say." For the next hour, they refined their presentation, deciding who would speak to each slide and practicing the transitions between their parts. Thomas would introduce the concept broadly. Then Maya would explain the theory of echoes of absence and how it manifested in everyday life. "This is where I think you should share some of your family's experience," Thomas said, pointing to a slide near the middle. "If you're comfortable with that," Maya nodded. "I brought a photo to show. And my grandmother's scarf." She pulled the scarf from her bag, a rectangle of deep red fabric with intricate embroidery along the edges, tiny birds and flowers in gold and green thread. Thomas leaned closer to see the detailed needlework. "It's beautiful," he said. "Did your grandmother make it?" "Yes," Maya replied. "In our culture, these patterns tell stories. Each bird represents a family member. See this one?" She pointed to a slightly larger bird with distinctive wing patterns. "That's for my mother. And these smaller ones are her siblings. My grandmother added this one." She touched a tiny bird near the edge. "For me when I was born, even though she never got to meet me." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly what our presentation is about," he finally said. "How absence takes physical form, becomes something you can touch and see." Maya carefully folded the scarf. "I'll wear it tomorrow." As they continued working, their conversation shifted to personal territories neither had expected to share when they were first paired together. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. "You don't have to answer if it's too personal." Maya nodded cautiously. "Why sociology? I mean, with your background and experiences, I'd think maybe international relations or political science or something." Maya considered the question. "I thought about those," she admitted. "But they focus on systems and institutions. Sociology lets me study how those systems affect real people's lives, how communities form and change, how people find connections even when everything around them is broken." She paused, then decided to share more. "When we first came here, we lived in a place with families from 12 different countries. Nobody spoke the same language, but within weeks, there was this system. Mrs. Liu from the third floor would watch all the children while parents went to job interviews. Mr. Abadi fixed everyone's plumbing problems. My mother mended clothes. No one planned it, No one was in charge, but this community just emerged from shared needs. Thomas nodded slowly. That's fascinating. In my world, everything is structured and planned. My whole life has been a series of steps toward becoming a lawyer like my father and his father before him. Is that what you want? Maya asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Thomas looked startled. Few people probably asked him that question. I don't know anymore, he said honestly. I used to think so. I'm good at debate, good at research and analysis. It made sense, but lately I've been wondering if I'm choosing it or just following the path of least resistance. He sighed. After my mom died, it seemed easier to just go with what everyone expected. Being the perfect son, the perfect student, it gave me something to focus on when everything else felt out of control. Maya recognized the strategy. Creating structure to fill absence. Exactly, Thomas said, looking at her with something like wonder. That's exactly it. How do you see these things so clearly? Watching, Maya said simply. When you spend most of your time observing instead of talking, you notice patterns. They worked for another hour, refining their speaking notes and making minor adjustments to the slides. Thomas practiced his introduction several times, adjusting his wording based on Maya's feedback. Maya rehearsed her part more quietly, still uncomfortable with being the center of attention but growing more confident in the material itself. You know what I realized? Thomas said as they were packing up. This is the first group project I've ever done where it actually felt like a partnership. Usually I just take over and do most of it myself because it's easier than coordinating with people who don't care as much. Maya smiled. I've never really been given the chance to contribute much before. Usually people assume I don't have ideas because I don't speak up right away. Their loss, Thomas said firmly. As they left the library, the campus was quieter than usual. Many students already gone for the weekend. They walked side by side, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon sun. Are your parents coming to watch the presentation? Thomas asked. Maya shook her head. They both work during the day, but I'll tell them all about it afterward. They always want to hear about my classes. She hesitated, then asked, What about your dad? Thomas laughed, but there was little humor in it. Dad doesn't come to school events unless it's a competition I've won or something that looks good on law school applications. A sociology class presentation wouldn't qualify. They stopped at the campus coffee shop, deciding to grab an early dinner before heading home. The place was half empty, the usual crush of students replaced by a mellow jazz soundtrack and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. Over sandwiches and tea, their conversation wandered beyond the project to classes they'd taken, books they'd read, places they hoped to see someday. Maya found herself talking more than she had with anyone outside her family in years. Something about Thomas's attentive listening made it easier to share thoughts she usually kept to herself. I never would have guessed we'd have so much in common, Thomas admitted. When Professor Callahan paired us up, I thought... He stopped abruptly. You thought I wouldn't contribute much, Maya finished for him. No accusation in her voice, yeah, Thomas admitted with a sheepish smile. I'm sorry about that. It's okay, Maya said. Most people think that. I don't exactly put myself out there. Why not? Thomas asked. You have such interesting perspectives. Maya stirred her tea, watching the liquid swirl. When we first came here, being quiet was safer. My English wasn't very good, and kids can be cruel about accents and mistakes. Later, it just became a habit, I guess. And then in college, she shrugged. By then, it was easier to stay invisible than to suddenly start being heard. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. But I'm glad you decided not to stay invisible for this project. As evening approached, they finalized their plans for the next day. They would meet 30 minutes before class to set up and do one final run-through. Thomas would handle the technical aspects, connecting the laptop to the projector, making sure the slides worked properly, while Maya would focus on staying calm and remembering the key points of her section. Get some sleep, Thomas advised as they parted outside the coffee shop. And don't worry too much. We've got this. Maya nodded, though they both knew sleep would probably be elusive. See you tomorrow. That night, as Maya laid out her clothes for the next day and placed her grandmother's scarf carefully on top, she felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. Tomorrow would push her far outside the comfortable shadow she'd inhabited for so long. But for the first time, she felt ready to step into the light, to be seen and heard. Her mother knocked softly on her bedroom door, then entered with a cup of chamomile tea. For nerves, she said, setting it on Maya's desk. I thought you might need it before your big presentation. Maya smiled gratefully. Her mother always seemed to sense when she was anxious, even when she tried to hide it. Are you worried? Her mother asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. A little, Maya admitted. It's not just speaking in front of everyone. I'll be sharing some of our family's story. Not everything, but enough. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Some stories are meant to be shared, she finally said. They don't belong only to us. That's part of what our presentation is about, Maya explained. How our experiences, especially the difficult ones, connect us to others even when we don't realize it. Her mother nodded slowly. This is why you've been so quiet all these years, isn't it? You've been listening, collecting these connections. Maya looked up, surprised by her mother's insight. I guess I have. Her mother reached out to touch her cheek gently. Then tomorrow, let them hear what you've learned. It's time. After her mother left, Maya sat at her desk, sipping the warm tea and looking at her notes one last time. Tomorrow would change things. She knew that with certainty. Once she gave voice to her observations, she couldn't return to complete silence. It was frightening, but also strangely liberating, like finally exhaling after holding her breath for years. She fell asleep thinking of all the invisible threads that had led to this moment. Her parents' journey, Thomas's loss, Professor Callahan's assignment, all the quiet years of watching and listening. Tomorrow, those threads would become visible, not just to her classmates, but perhaps even to herself. Presentation day arrived with a sky so bright blue it seemed unreal. Maya woke before her alarm, her heart already beating a little faster than normal. She'd slept in fits and starts, her dreams filled with standing in front of the class unable to speak, or worse, speaking and having everyone walk out. Now, as morning light filtered through her curtains, she took deep breaths and reminded herself of all the preparation she and Thomas had done. Today's the day, she whispered to herself, touching her grandmother's scarf that lay folded on her dresser. In the kitchen, her father was already up, making coffee before his early taxi shift. He looked up when Maya entered, noting her careful appearance, the nice jeans without any fading, the blue sweater she saved for special occasions, her hair neatly brushed instead of hastily pulled back. Big day? He asked, pouring a cup of coffee for her. Maya nodded, accepting the cup gratefully. Presentation in sociology. Her father studied her face. You look nervous. That's not like you for schoolwork. This one's different, Maya explained. I'm talking about some of our family's experiences, not everything, just enough to explain a concept. Understanding dawned in her father's eyes. He was quiet for a moment, stirring sugar into his own coffee. You know, he finally said, when we left our country, I had to leave behind many things. Books, photographs, the watch my father gave me when I finished school. But the hardest things to leave were the stories. Who would remember them if we were gone? Maya listened, realizing this was part of what her presentation was about. How absence created its own presence. How lost stories echoed in the spaces they left behind. When you tell pieces of our story, her father continued, you give those memories a new home. They don't just live in our heads anymore. That's important. Maya felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. I hope I tell them right. Her father squeezed her shoulder gently. You will. You've always been the one who notices everything, who remembers the details others forget. The bus ride to campus felt both longer and shorter than usual. Maya wore her grandmother's scarf now, the familiar weight of it around her shoulders a comfort. She touched the embroidered birds absently, thinking about the women in her family who had created and preserved these patterns through war and displacement, making sure the stories they held weren't lost. Thomas was waiting outside the classroom building, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He looked different today, more serious than his usual confident self, wearing a button-down shirt instead of his typical casual clothes. I thought you might need this, he said, handing her one of the cups. I added extra sugar. For energy. Thanks, Maya said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. You look nice, Thomas smiled a bit nervously. Figured I should at least try to look professional. Is that your grandmother's scarf? It looks even better on. Maya nodded, adjusting the scarf slightly. Ready for our final run-through? They found an empty bench in the quiet courtyard behind the building and went over their notes one last time. Thomas would open with the broader concept, then transition to Maya for the theoretical framework and personal illustrations. They'd practiced the handoff several times, making sure it felt natural. Remember, Thomas said as they finished, just look at me if you start feeling nervous. Pretend you're just explaining it to me in the library like we've been doing all week. Maya nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Somehow the idea of focusing on Thomas's familiar face made the thought of 30 staring classmates less overwhelming. As they walked toward the classroom, Thomas asked, "Did you sleep at all?" "Not really," Maya admitted. "You?" "Maybe 2 hours," he said with a tired smile. "I kept thinking about what you said yesterday, about how we create structure to fill absence. I realized that's basically been my entire life strategy since my mom died." Maya looked at him curiously. "Is that a bad thing?" Thomas shrugged. "Not necessarily, but I think I've been so focused on filling that space that I never really acknowledged it was there. That's what's powerful about our concept, I think. Recognizing the absences instead of just trying to cover them up." They reached the classroom 15 minutes early. Only Professor Callahan was there, setting up the computer for presentations. He looked up when they entered, his eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of Maya's colorful scarf, a stark contrast to her usually plain, forgettable clothes. "Good morning," he greeted them. "You're presenting today, correct?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied. "Is it all right if we get set up now?" "By all means," Professor Callahan said, stepping aside from the computer. "I'm looking forward to your take on the assignment. It's been a mix so far. Some groups really grasped the concept. Others." He trailed off diplomatically. While Thomas connected his laptop and loaded their presentation, Maya arranged her notes on the small podium they would share. Her hands trembled slightly, and she took another deep breath, focusing on the familiar words she'd written rather than the gradually filling classroom. Students trickled in, their usual Monday morning conversations creating a low hum of background noise. Few paid attention to Maya and Thomas at the front of the room. Group presentations were routine in Professor Callahan's classes, and most students were more concerned with their own upcoming turns than watching others. At exactly 10 wire, Professor Callahan called the class to order. "Today we continue with our Invisible Connections presentations. First up, Thomas Chen and Maya Peterson." A few heads turned in surprise. Some classmates genuinely hadn't noticed Maya until her name was called, and others seemed surprised that the quiet girl who never spoke was presenting today. Thomas stepped up to the podium first, his debate training evident in his confident stance and clear voice. "Good morning, everyone. Today, Maya and I will be introducing a concept we're calling Echoes of Absence." The first slide appeared on the screen, a simple black and white image of an empty chair at an otherwise occupied dinner table. The visual was striking in its simplicity, immediately drawing attention to the unoccupied space. Thomas continued, "When Professor Callahan assigned this project on invisible connections in society, most of us probably thought about the things that visibly link people: technology, economic systems, shared interests. But Maya and I became interested in something different: how absence itself creates connections." He moved through the introductory slides with practiced ease, explaining how loss and absence weren't just negative spaces but active presences that shaped people's lives and created invisible communities of shared experience. "We don't need to have the same losses to understand each other's empty spaces," Thomas explained, his voice growing slightly more personal. "The experience of missing something important, whether it's a person, a place, an opportunity, or even a sense of belonging, creates a kind of map that helps us navigate other people's similar experiences." As Thomas reached the transition point in their presentation, Maya felt her heart beating faster. In a moment, it would be her turn to speak, not just to answer a direct question or provide a brief response, but to truly be heard. "Now," Thomas said, turning slightly toward her, "Maya will explain the theoretical framework we've developed and share some real-world examples of how these echoes of absence function in everyday life." The class's attention shifted to Maya as she stepped forward. She looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some already looking bored, a few checking their phones under their desks. For a brief, terrifying moment, her mind went blank, the carefully prepared words evaporating. Then her eyes found Thomas, who gave her an encouraging nod, and she remembered his advice: "Pretend you're just talking to me." Maya took a deep breath and began, "Thank you, Thomas." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying better than she'd expected in the quiet classroom. The concept of echoes of absence comes from observing how people carry their losses with them, and how these invisible burdens create connections that cross all other social boundaries. To her surprise, once she started speaking, the words flowed more easily than in any of their practice sessions. The slides advanced as she explained their theoretical framework, how absence created its own presence, how loss changed perception, how people recognized in each other the shapes of missing pieces. When something important is taken away, she explained, her voice growing stronger, it doesn't simply disappear. It leaves an impression like a footprint in sand. And people who have similar footprints in their lives can recognize the pattern, even if the specific losses are different. Maya touched her grandmother's scarf as she moved to the next part of the presentation. To illustrate this concept, I'd like to share a personal example. The classroom had grown unusually still. Even the students who had been surreptitiously checking their phones were now watching her, perhaps surprised by the quiet girl's unexpected eloquence, or simply curious about what personal story she might share. "This scarf belonged to my grandmother," Maya said, her fingers tracing the embroidered birds. "She made it in my family's home country before Civil War forced my parents to flee. They could take very little with them, just a few photographs, some important documents, and this scarf." She carefully unwound it and held it up so the class could see the intricate needlework. In our culture, these patterns tell family stories. Each bird represents a different family member. This larger one is my mother. These are her siblings, and this tiny one near the edge is me. Added when I was born, even though my grandmother never got to meet me. Maya paused, looking at the scarf in her hands. "My grandmother died before I was 2 years old. I have no memories of her, no experiences to miss. But growing up with this scarf, hearing stories about her, seeing my bird among the others, I felt the shape of her absence. It wasn't an empty space. It was filled with meaning." She carefully folded the scarf and continued. "This is a simple example, but it illustrates something important about absence. It's never just nothing. It's a presence of its own kind, shaping how we see the world and connect with others." As Maya moved through her portion of the presentation, explaining how these echoes of absence appeared in literature, history, and everyday interactions, she noticed something unexpected happening in the classroom. Students who normally dozed through presentations were sitting up straight, watching her with genuine interest. Professor Callahan had set down his coffee mug, his grading pen motionless in his hand. "We see these echoes everywhere once we learn to recognize them," Maya continued, the international student who notices how another person handles unfamiliar food, because they too have navigated that uncertainty. The child of divorce who can tell which classmates come from separated families by small behavioral cues. The person who has experienced discrimination recognizing the subtle vigilance in someone else from a different marginalized group. She showed a slide with concentric circles, representing different types of absence, from small daily disappointments to profound losses of homeland, loved ones, or identity. What connects all these experiences, Maya explained, is not the specific absence itself, but the way we carry it with us. These invisible burdens create bridges between people who might otherwise have nothing in common. As she spoke, Maya felt something shifting in her own perspective. For years, she'd observed these patterns from the outside, collecting and categorizing them in her notebook but never really sharing them. Now, giving voice to these observations was like stepping into the pattern herself, becoming visible in a new way. "When we recognize these connections," she said, her voice growing softer but more intense, "something powerful happens. We begin to see that none of us is alone in our experiences of loss or absence. Even in our most private griefs, we are connected to countless others who carry similar shapes inside them." Maya glanced at Thomas, who was watching her with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, recognition, perhaps of seeing himself reflected in her words. They had agreed he would take over for the conclusion, and she gave him a small nod to indicate she was ready for the transition. Thomas stepped forward, but before he could speak, Maya added one final thought, the words coming to her in the moment rather than from her prepared notes. "In sociology, we often study how visible similarities bring people together, shared interests, backgrounds, or goals. But sometimes it's our invisible wounds that create the strongest bonds. The empty spaces in our lives reach toward each other, creating connections we can feel even when we can't see them." There was complete silence in the classroom as Maya finished speaking. No shuffling papers, no whispered comments. Not even the usual background noise of a large group of people breathing and shifting in their seats. For a moment, it felt as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. Thomas cleared his throat slightly, clearly moved by what had just happened. "Thank you, Maya," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect that made the formal phrase sound heartfelt. He moved into their conclusion smoothly, summarizing the main points and connecting their concept back to the broader themes of the course. But Maya could sense that something had changed in the room. The students weren't just listening politely to finish out the class period. They were genuinely engaged, many of them nodding at key points or exchanging meaningful glances with friends. As Thomas showed their final slide, a simple image of hands reaching across empty space, he added an unplanned personal note. "Working on this project has changed how I see the world," he admitted. "It's made me recognize absences I've been carrying without acknowledging them, and see connections I'd been missing. I hope it might do the same for some of you." When they finished, the silence held for another beat before Professor Callahan started the applause. It was warmer and more sustained than the polite clapping that usually followed student presentations. A few students even put down their phones to join in. "Thank you, Thomas and Maya," Professor Callahan said, his voice slightly different than his usual professional tone. "That was quite illuminating. You've given us all something to think about." As Maya and Thomas returned to their seats, several students caught Maya's eye, offering small smiles or nods of acknowledgement. Liwei, who sometimes sat near her, whispered, "That was amazing," as she passed his desk. For the rest of the class period, Maya sat in a kind of daze, barely registering the next group's presentation on social media networks. She felt drained but strangely peaceful, as if she'd finally released something she'd been carrying for years. When class ended, Professor Callahan asked them to stay behind for a moment. "I want to commend you both on an excellent presentation," he said once the other students had filed out. "It was conceptually sophisticated, thoughtfully presented, and genuinely moving." "Thank you, sir," Thomas replied while Maya nodded, still feeling the lingering effects of speaking so personally in front of the class. "Maya," Professor Callahan said, turning to her directly, "I've had you in my class for nearly 3 years, and I don't think I've ever heard you speak more than a few sentences at a time. I had no idea you were developing such thoughtful sociological frameworks." Maya felt her cheeks warm at the attention. "I've always found it easier to write than speak," she admitted. "Well, you should speak more often," the professor said kindly. "The class would benefit from your perspective." He gathered his papers, adding, "I look forward to reading your full paper on this concept. I think it has real potential." As they left the building together, Thomas turned to Maya with a wide smile. "We did it! And you were absolutely brilliant." "We both were," Maya corrected him, still processing what had happened in the classroom. "Maybe," Thomas conceded, "but something changed when you started speaking. Did you notice? The whole room just shifted." Maya had noticed but couldn't explain it. "I think people connected with the idea," she said simply. "It was more than that," Thomas insisted. "You gave everyone permission to recognize something they usually pretend isn't there." He paused, then added more quietly, "You gave me permission too."